Good evening. My name is Ki-sang Lee, the host of the 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue. The event determines changing risk factors and discusses measures to secure individuals' safety and peace under the theme of peace and human securities. During the domestic session, we discussed the COVID-19 pandemic and peace on the Korean Peninsula. For a global session, we identify a changing security environment and will discuss internationally wide-ranging topics, such as measures on ending conflicts and issues regarding peace settlement on Korean Peninsula, with the theme of peace building and conflict transformation during the COVID-19 and beyond. The session will discuss the following. 1. State of the field. 2. Peace in a time of COVID-19. 3. What is to be done? From the three topics mentioned above, we will hear different opinions from different institutes. The event is live-streamed on Seoul Metropolitan Government's official YouTube channels. The video will be available on the official YouTube channel and website of the Seoul Peace Dialogue. A text message translation is provided and service is available on the digital devices you have. The event is held indoors right now, so where the strict preventive measures has been practiced. For better presentation delivery, please understand that the speakers will not be wearing the mask. First, let me introduce the participants here at the studio. Wang Jin-seo, President of the Seoul Institute. John Delury, Professor of Yonsei University, Graduate School of International Studies. Jung-in Moon, Chairman of the Inter-Korean Cooperation Committee. He will also be the moderator of today's session. And now, I would like to introduce the participants via video conference. Kevin Clemens, Director of Toda Peace Institute. Welcome. Stein Tønnesen, Research Professor of Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Jenny Lilja, Director of Studies, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Muthaya Alagapa, Visiting Professor, Asian Europe Institute of University of Malaya. Charles E. Morrison, former President and Adjunct Research Fellow of East-West Center. Richard McGregor, Senior Fellow of Lowy Institute. Melly Caballero Anthony, Professor of International Relations and Head, Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies. S. Rajaranam, School of International Studies. Orville Schell, Arthur Rose Director, Center on U.S.-China Relations on Asian Society. Peter Hayes, Director of Nautilus Institute. Jonathan Powell, CEO of Intermediate. Kee B. Park, Lecturer at Harvard Medical School. Jean Lee, Director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation, Center for Korean History and Public Policy. Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Last but not least, Eun-jung Lee, Director of the Graduate School of East Asian Studies, Director of the Institute of the Korean Studies, the Free University of Berlin. Now, to officially begin the global session, Wang Jin-seo, president of the Seoul Institute, will deliver his welcome speech. Please welcome Wang Jin-seo.
안녕하십니까 여러분. Hello everyone. 서울연구원장 서왕진입니다. 서울 시민 여러분, 그리고 한반도의 평화에 관심을 기울이시는 국민 여러분, 또한 평화와 안보 관련 연구를 주도하는 해외 연구기관을 대표하여 이번 세션에 참석해 주신 연구자 여러분, 인간안보와 평화라는 주제로 개최되는 2020년 서울평화대화에 모시게 되어 매우 영광스럽고 반가운 마음입니다. 특별세션의 사회를 맡아주신 문정인 교수님과 발표를 담당해 주시는 존 딜러리 교수님께도 특별히 감사의 마음을 전합니다. 이번 특별세션의 주제는 코로나19 시대의 평화구축과 갈등 전환입니다. 이번 세션에서는 코로나19 팬데믹이 가져온 안보와 평화 패러다임의 변화, 미중 갈등, 한반도 평화구축과 같은 전통적인 안보 쟁점과 비전통적인 안보 문제들을 동시에 논의하고자 합니다. 또한 오랜 기간 동안 안보와 평화 문제 연구를 선도하고 있는 대표적인 해외 연구기관 전문 연구자들의 통찰력과 지혜를 나누고자 합니다. 사실 세계 곳곳에 계신 연구자분들이 직접 만나지 못하고 온라인 공간을 통해 만나게 된 오늘의 이 자리가 바로 코로나19 대유행이 바꾸어 놓은 현실을 잘 보여주는 한 예라는 생각이 듭니다. With 코로나와 언택트라는 새로운 용어는 삶이 코로나 위기 이전으로 되돌아갈 수 없다는 사실을 잘 표현하고 있다고도 생각합니다. With 코로나가 현실이 되고 포스트 코로나 시대는 코로나를 경험하기 이전의 과거와는 전혀 다른 세상이 될 것이라는 전망이 현실로 다가오면서 그동안 국제사회가 협력하면서 평화를 정착시키려 했던 다양한 노력과 시도들이 새로운 시험대 위에 오르기도 했습니다. 위기 상황에서 긴밀하게 협조해야 할 국가들이 자국민을 우선시하는 정책을 펼치면서 코로나 방역, 백신 및 치료제의 개발 공급을 둘러싼 논란이 거세지기도 했습니다. 오랫동안 만들어왔던 국제적 협력 체제가 효과적으로 작동하지 못하고 있는 한 부분입니다. 하지만 코로나와 같은 감염병 위기는 개별 국가들의 능력만으로 싸울 수 있는 대상이 아니라 인류 전체 생존을 위협하는 공동의 적입니다. 따라서 코로나로 인한 위기는 모든 국가들이 협력하여 같이 극복해야 하는 공동의 전쟁입니다. 다행스럽게도 인류는 공동의 위기를 극복하는 과정에서 절망하기보다는 항상 협력의 방법을 찾아내어 실행해왔던 역사를 가지고 있습니다. 1차 세계대전이라는 위기를 극복하는 과정에서 국제연맹이 탄생하여 국제적인 협력의 길을 개척하였으며 2차 세계대전을 겪으며 탄생한 국제연합을 통해 지금까지 세계는 여러 어려움을 함께 극복해 왔습니다. 코로나 감염병이 장기화되는 상황을 맞이하여 세계 각국의 중앙정부와 도시정부, NGO들과 국제기구들이 자성의 목소리를 높이기 시작하였으며 각국의 경험을 공유하고 상호 협력할 수 있는 길을 찾으려고 노력하고 있는 것은 참으로 다행스러운 일이 아닐 수 없습니다. 전통적으로 안보 연구는 국가 간 전쟁을 가장 큰 안보 위험 요인이자 평화를 제외하는 요소로 여겨왔습니다. 그러나 냉전이 종식되었고 인권, 테러, 빈곤, 차별, 감염병, 환경오염 등 인간의 삶을 위협하는 다양한 요인들이 안보의 중요 부분으로 새롭게 부각되었습니다. 즉 전통적인 안보 개념을 넘어서는 인간안보 개념이 주목받기 시작한 것입니다. 2020년 전 세계를 뒤덮고 있는 코로나19 팬데믹은 바로 이와 같은 인간안보와 적극적인 평화의 문제의식을 전면화하고 있는 것입니다. 코로나19는 강대국과 약소국을 가리지 않으며 부국과 빈국을 가리지 않고 있습니다. 또한 국가와 도시를 망라하는 인류적 문제가 되고 있습니다. 이런 가운데 한반도는 여전히 긴장과 위험 상황에 놓여 있습니다. 2018년의 희망 섞인 모색과 시도들은 여전히 우리에게 기억으로 남아있지만 지금 우리는 예측할 수 없는 미래를 마주하고 있습니다. 서울은 대한민국의 중심 도시로서 70여 년에 이르는 한반도의 전쟁 상태를 끝내고 한반도의 평화공존의 질서를 만들어내는데 중앙정부와 함께 의미 있는 역할을 담당하고자 합니다. 남북한이 적대적 갈등의 전환과 평화구축을 실현하기 위해서는 중앙정부 차원에서만이 아니라 도시정부, 시민단체, 시민 개개인의 영역에서 적극적인 노력과 참여가 요구됩니다. 과거의 서울은 개발과 압축 성장의 상징 도시였다면 미래의 서울은 복지와 환경, 문화 그리고 평화의 도시를 목표로 합니다. 저희 서울연구원은 서울시가 중앙정부와 시민사회단체 그리고 시민 개개인을 연결시키는 튼튼한 평화의 허리를 만들어낼 수 있도록 적극적으로 정책 개발과 연구에 힘을 쏟고 있습니다. 오늘 모신 여러분들은 유럽, 아시아, 미주와 오세아니아 등 세계의 여러 다른 지역에 기반을 두고 평화와 인간안보 또 전통안보 등의 연구 분야를 주도하고 있습니다. 여러분들은 그동안 축적된 연구 성과들을 바탕으로 코로나19 대위기 상황에서 새롭게 부각되고 있는 인간안보 관련 쟁점들과 한반도의 평화구축에 대한 통찰력과 지혜를 갖고 계실 것입니다. 서울연구원은 그런 여러분들의 통찰력과 지혜를 함께 나누고자 합니다. 서울연구원은 오늘 서울평화대화를 시작으로 국제적인 평화연구 컨소시엄이 형성되기를 기대합니다. 이번 대화는 인간안보와 갈등 전환을 위한 전 세계적 협력에 동참하는 첫 출발이 될 것을 기대합니다. 마하트마 간디는 세상 모든 사람이 그렇게 하기로 마음먹을 때 세상은 평화로워질 것이다 라고 말했습니다. 간디의 말처럼 오늘 우리의 만남은 세상이 평화로워질 수 있도록 평화를 만들기로 마음먹었기 때문에 이루어질 수 있었다고 생각합니다. 끝으로 이번 서울평화대화를 통해 서울 시민들만이 아니라 평화와 안보에 관심을 갖고 있는 세계의 모든 사람들이 일상적인 삶 속에서 진정한 평화의 길을 찾을 수 있다는 공감대를 가질 수 있기를 기대합니다. 또한 서울연구원과 오늘 모인 해외 평화연구기관이 지속적으로 개인, 도시, 국가, 세계 평화를 위해 함께 고민하고 논의할 수 있기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. Thank you very much. It was welcome speech by President of Seoul Institute, Wang Jin-seo. Next, it is my great honor to introduce to you John Delury, professor of Yonsei University, who will deliver his opening remark. Please welcome Mr. John Delury.
Thank you very much. Thank you to President Seo and the Seoul Institute and to all the people who've worked so hard here at the Seoul City to make this possible. Let me welcome everyone. You have giant faces on the screens here. It's so good to see all of you, and also welcome the audience on YouTube in Seoul and around the world, hopefully including some of my students. As President Seo said, and as we all know, we're living in a time of great disruption. I think Tibetan Buddhists call this a bardo, an in-between space. So it's maybe no surprise that when I sat down to try to write out these thoughts as an opening for our dialogue, each time I stared at my home computer, I heard the screaming of our children fighting, making it impossible for me to concentrate. That's a familiar sound to any household, and I tried to estimate there's millions or tens or hundreds of millions of us out there locked down with our loved ones in a time when going to school has become logging into school. And I was getting frustrated, and then it occurred to me that my kids shouting might not be a distraction from our project here today, that it in fact might be the essence of what we're doing. So I stopped to listen to them argue. My 9-year-old son was making me an espresso, and our 5-year-old daughter was upset that she couldn't get to make it too. So it was a classic demand to participate. Her brother insisted it was his prerogative. First, he shouted back at her. But as she started to cry, or pretend to cry, his voice softened and he began to reason with her. Now, all this was happening in Korean, so on my part, there was definitely a lot of information loss. I decided to do nothing, to not intervene. And when they eventually emerged from the kitchen with my son with my Nespresso in hand, my daughter was clearly still not happy, but she wasn't crying and she wasn't screaming. And I thought to myself, is this peace? I thought of Johan Galtung's definition that peace is having conflict, creatively and nonviolently. Later that evening, when I made my wife a cocktail as a reward for surviving another day, we made sure that our daughter got to carry it to her, which she did with the single-mindedness of a neurosurgeon, and we have one of those joining our dialogue. And our son didn't get upset. And I thought, is this conflict resolution? Conflict is like air and water. It's all around us. It's an essential ingredient in the recipe of being human. We engage in conflict with those we love and those we hate, with our fellow citizens and with other nations. If we were stranded alone on a deserted island, we would be left with our inner conflict. So peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather a certain way of having it. Like drinking cool, clean water instead of toxic runoff. Like breathing fresh forest air instead of factory smog. Peace research generates empirically based theories on how to do conflict in creative and nonviolent ways. Geopolitical analysis identifies where the risks of large-scale, violent, destructive conflict are most serious. And conflict mediation intervenes in ongoing conflicts or emerging ones in order to help put them on a nonviolent trajectory. And those, in a nutshell, are the three subject areas around which our sessions today will revolve. I hardly have to belabor these points to this group. Our dialogue brings together renowned experts in peace and conflict studies, geopolitics and international relations, and negotiation and mediation. We're bringing together academic theorists, think tank analysts, and real-world practitioners with scholarly training and practical experience from a wide array of fields: historians, political scientists, sociologists, doctors, soldiers, politicians, diplomats, journalists. We're also speaking with one another from an exhausting mix of time zones. Kevin and Charles are up way past their bedtime in New Zealand and Hawaii. Orville Shell is up well before the crack of dawn to zoom in from the Berkeley Hills. And the remainder of us are hunkered down somewhere in between: Sydney, Seoul, Singapore, Oslo, Stockholm, Berlin, London, Washington, D.C. Today's Seoul Peace Dialogue is preparing the way for next year's Seoul Peace Forum, which will be larger in scale and more directed toward an outside global audience. The Seoul Peace Forum hopes to take its place among the many global peace and security conferences already out there, from newcomers like the Paris Peace Forum to old standbys like the Munich Security Conference. Hosted here in Seoul, a short drive from the DMZ, a short flight from Beijing, Tokyo, and Vladivostok, naturally, the forum will bring a focus on the Korean Peninsula and East Asian dimensions to peace and security. But as you can see from the group we have today, the range of expertise and experience is truly global. And the aim is to explore both the regional and global sides of challenges to peacemaking and opportunities for peace building. So our dialogue today is not the starting point of a process. We are in fact joining an ongoing global conversation around advancing peace. Nor is it the endpoint with a specific product or outcome in mind. Our goal, as I understand it, is to listen and learn from one another, strengthening relationships among our like-minded organizations and institutions, and generating ideas for future action. The impediments to peace at a global scale can seem pretty insurmountable. The environmental crisis of climate change, the health emergency of this pandemic and maybe the next one, the ever-present shadow of nuclear war or accident. Local risks to peace and security here in Korea and around us in East Asia are just as formidable. US-China rivalry, maritime and territorial disputes, suppression of ethnic and religious minorities, hostile relations with a nuclear-armed North Korea. So while some people out there may ask, why another peace forum? And even some of you may have looked at your calendars and thought, oh no, not another webinar. I think we can all agree, in light of the gravity of the challenges we face, as well as the inescapable fact of conflict in human affairs, really there cannot be enough dialogue on the issues we are wrestling with today. I look forward to our session, learning from each of you and from the wisdom of our group. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was an opening remark by John Delury. Now we'll begin the global session. The session is chaired by Chung-in Moon, chairman of the Inter-Korean Cooperation Committee.
Hello, how are you? Let me clarify one thing. In fact, this event was envisioned by late Mayor Park Won-soon. He was a visionary, and in fact, he asked me to set up the Seoul Peace Forum, but he passed away. And however, Dr. Seo, who is a very close friend of Mayor Park Won-soon, thought that it would be wonderful to have a Seoul Peace Dialogue as a way of preparing for Seoul Peace Forum next year. Therefore, we ventured this webinar to commemorate the late Park Won-soon. Therefore, this Seoul Peace Dialogue is dedicated to late Mayor Park Won-soon. And also, since moderator introduced you, but I have to skip it. But I think the audience, we have a lot of Seoul citizens are now watching this YouTube. Therefore, let me introduce some of you, each one of you, very briefly. Kevin Clement, he lives in New Zealand, but he's one of the leading peace scholar in the world. He's a retired professor, but he never retires. But anyhow, he's from the New Zealand. He's the director of Toda Peace Institute. And then we down left is Eun Jung Lee. Professor Eun Jung Lee is full endowed professor at the University of Berlin. She founded and in fact nourished a Center for Korean Studies there. She has a huge building at the University of Berlin. Therefore, when you have a chance to visit Berlin, please visit her. She'll entertain you very nicely. And Jin Lee now is heading the Korea program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. But she was a journalist. She opened up Associate Press office in Pyongyang, and he had a real hard time there. But after she came back to the United States, he decided to work for the Woodrow Wilson Center. She has been doing enormous work relating to North Korea as well as Asia Pacific. Ki Park, he always looks like a very young man, but he's a neurosurgeon. Okay, he's supposed to do a lot of surgery, surgical works, but he has been doing a lot of humanitarian business with North Korea. Now he's trying to build surgical operation rooms in North Korea with the help of World Health Organization, and he is really a pioneer in the area of humanitarian assistance to North Korea. In fact, he's one of the major person who really, drove the State Department to change and relax some of the sanction measures in North Korea on humanitarian issues. And Jonathan Powell, he's a living legend on conflict resolution. He was a chief of staff to former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was involved in the Northern Ireland in issues, and he also deeply involved in the Colombian Civil War, and also he has been doing a lot of work on North Korea nuclear issue, and most recently Afghanistan issue. Therefore, he's kind of a living witness to the conflict resolution history. Welcome, Jonathan. And Obil Shell, another living witness to the transformation of China. In fact, I learned about China after I read his book, Getting Rich is Glorious. And he's the author of that million-seller book called Getting Rich is Glorious. And he's in California at 4 o'clock in the morning. Obil? Thank you. And we have a Melly from Singapore. She's an expert on the nuclear security issues and non-traditional security issues. And also Richard McGregor from Sydney, Australia. In fact, the Asia Reckoning book, I wrote the interpretative introduction of a Korean translation of your book. It's an excellent book. And a lot of diplomatic historians should be ashamed after they read your book. Anyhow, welcome addition to our Seoul Peace Dialogue. And Charles Morrison is another legend. He was the president of East-West Center in Hawaii almost more than 20 years. But finally he knew how to retire. Now he's retired, but he's still very active researcher. He was a very respected scholar on Asia Pacific affairs a long time since. And welcome, Charles. And Mutai Alagapa. He's another legend too, okay? Mutai, are we in Kuala Lumpur or the Washington, D.C.? I cannot hear you. D.C., anyhow. He always commute between Kuala Lumpur and Washington, but he was the director of the East-West Center in Washington office, and he, published the seminal books on Asian security and nuclear issues in Asia. Again, welcome. Jenny from SIPRI, Stockholm Peace Institute. Welcome. And my old friend Stein Tennyson, he was the director of a PRIOP, Oslo Peace Research Institute, 10 years. But he hasn't retired. It's very strange. What is your retirement age in Norway? Anyhow, and another my old friend, Peter Hayes, he co-founded the Nautilus Institute, and he recently completed a major project on pandemic nuclear nexus with folks in Nagasaki. Anyhow, we have a wonderful combination of researchers here. What we'll do is this. We have a very limited time, okay? We divided, as John Dillery had notified you, that this discussion will be broken into 3 categories. The first category is about state of discipline. Okay, what is the status of peace research? And second category is about what are the implications of COVID-19 on peace and war or conflict in the Asia Pacific. And third group is about what to do, okay, what actions to be taken. And we have groups. In the first group, we have Kevin, Stein, Jenny, and Muthaya. You belong to first group. We'll have about 30 minutes, okay? And second group is Charles, Richard, Melly, Obil, and Peter. You'll be talking about implications of COVID-19 on Asia Pacific. Third group is composed of Jonathan, Ki Park, Jin Lee, Lee Eun-jung, So Wang-jin. And we'll start, and after that, when you have a group discussion, okay, we'll solely focus on group discussion. But all the 3 sessions are over, we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes to have a general discussion. So therefore, you can raise your hand if you have any comments and questions. Okay, now, we'll start the first session, okay? It's a state of discipline, okay? When you talk about peace studies, after the Vietnamese War, there was a burgeoning trend of peace studies. And as, John, Dillery mentioned about Johan Galtung and all those leading figures in peace studies. But nowadays, the peace studies has become sunset industry, okay? Even cottage industry, okay? Why is that? Maybe Kevin, Toda Institute has been doing a lot of research on recent trend of peace studies. Would you start with what you're doing at the Toda Peace Institute?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Sal. Thank you, Chung-In, and thank you all for inviting me to this webinar. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm hearing a lot of echo. Is that all right? I presented a paper, and I don't propose to read it all to you, but as Chung-In says, what was an expanding industry in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s when peace research was expanding very rapidly, there has been a kind of a shrinking and a marginalization of the field over the past, 5 years in particular. Many of the remaining peace programs, for example, that at the United States Institute for Peace, have been forced to adopt a very more state-centric security focus in order to retain their funding. And so that raises an important question about whether peace research, both in terms of research and practice, still has a distinct identity and can regain the influence it had in the 80s and 90s, when it really did have a very profound influence all around the world on conflict prevention, on conflict transformation, development and peace building, and cooperative security. And there's no doubt that from when the founding fathers like Galtung and the Bouldings and others founded peace research, we've had to confront some extraordinarily major challenges which have been mentioned by John and others. These include climate change, populism and nationalism, 21st century authoritarianism, the negative role of social media, national and global inequality, increasing political division and polarization, subversion of multilateral and regional organizations, the undermining of hard-won agreements on arms control and disarmament, and on top of it all, how do we deal with COVID-19 as a major global challenge? All of our theories suggest that should be a superordinate challenge which should provoke high levels of cooperation and collaboration. But it's not at all clear at the moment that this is what's happening. And indeed, as I think John mentioned, it's highly possible that there'll be a nationalist scramble for scarce vaccine resources, and the wealthy may end up benefiting from those, and the unwealthy in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and so forth may not. So the big question is whether peace research still has a role in the face of all of these different dilemmas, and what is it? Has peace research become too close to policymakers and losing its critical and normative edge? Is it too wedded to a theory of change which is based on influencing top-down decision makers, rather than kind of doing a much deeper sort of contextual approach and looking at what we might call local level, bottom-up strategies for peace? Is the field to be conceived as research for peace or research about peace? And I think this is a very interesting distinction. If it's the latter, about peace, is the conceptualization of peace encapsulated in the idea of positive peace still persuasive? And is there any agreement on what we will mean by peace, and how do we understand it? It's clear that it's always been a normative discipline. We don't want to just understand the world, but we do want to change it in a positive direction. And we have a range of values that we're seeking to represent in this field, such as nonviolence, respect for others, a general orientation towards pacifist solutions where possible, harmonious relationships, doing no harm, humanitarianism, human dignity, peace, justice, compassion, local ownership, etc., etc. And they have, I think, been the guiding principles for our field, and they underline the fact that we're essentially a norm-driven discipline. However, I think there's also widespread recognition that this discipline's got to be based on high research standards, sound methods, transparency, public available evidence, and commitment to putting our insight and wisdom into the public domain. There's I think, a general agreement about the importance of positive peace, and there's a whole set of efforts to try and measure these with the kind of peace continuum, the Quality Peace Project, the Many Pieces Project, Positive Peace Index and the Inclusive Peace Projects. So I think we're beginning to really grapple with that kind of whole question of what peace means for the 21st century. But we have to work very hard to make sure that we're not captured by a kind of an old IR, hard-headed realist position. And that's why human security, as has been mentioned already, I think provides a framework that can help us bring together peace studies with this emphasis on human needs and critical security studies, and accompanied with a sort of a much broader conception of cooperative security and indeed common security of the kind that we worked very hard on in the 1980s, which also seems to have lost track of. And in all of this, we've really got to figure out ways in which we combine our research with solid practice and with solid policy advice and with strong collaboration with civil society actors. So the world of 2020, as has been noticed, is utterly chaotic. The pandemic's focused inadequacies of the global system. It's created a permissive environment for autocratic nationalism. Military expenditure is rising. There are deep conflicts over big power transitions, especially in Northeast Asia. And looming over everything are existential challenges from environmental degradation and climate change. And many of these things I've already mentioned weren't even on our agenda when Peace Research was founded, and we were mainly concerned with bipolar conflict and preventing nuclear war. So we need to focus much more attention, therefore, on what this all means for our project, but more importantly, what does it mean for the democratic project and for the Enlightenment project in general. We need new definitions of peace and security that suit the conditions of the 21st century. The non-traditional threat of pandemic is essentially kind of closed down the world as we knew it in terms of communications and transport and tourism. So this means we have a major problem
Kevin,
on our hands in trying to identify.
Kevin, you have 10 seconds to complete.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Goodness. Okay, my agenda is as follows then. I think we've got to focus new ways on breathing new life into multilateral and regional institutions. We've got to work with governments and UN to ensure the achievement of the SDGs by 2030. We've got to figure out how to get collaboration around existential threats of climate change and pandemics. We've got to ensure that big power rivalry is contained. We've got to develop new arms control and disarmament mechanisms to control excessive militarization. We've got to think about the interrelationships between these different problems. We've got to focus on how to outlaw aggression and violence and the concrete mechanisms that need to be developed to prosecute such behavior. We've got to reset the dangerous drifts into trade wars and mutual hostility between the US and China, seek a new denuclearization initiative on the Korean Peninsula, and work on ways of maintaining hopefulness and optimism in the face of cynicism and despair. Sorry for going on too long.
Okay, Stein. You cannot exceed more than 3 minutes, okay? Kevin enjoyed the advantage of being forerunner, okay? But you will have a 3 minute so that we can have a second round. But Stein, we talked about the Johan Galtung. Johan Galtung, established the Oslo Peace Institute. But there is some kind of criticism of prior, because now Johan Galtung's approach has been very much normative, but Oslo Peace Institute has become too scholarly, too empirical, too objective, and Oslo Peace Institute is not interested in real actions. Nobel Peace Institute handled that issue. Is that true? And you served as the director of PRIO for 10 years. How would you see the current status of your peace research at the PRIO, and what is the future direction? Within 3 minutes. Sorry.
I'm very proud of what PRIO is doing. It's true that Johan Galtung, as our founder, has criticized us. He just turned 90 on United Nations Day in October. And our veteran researcher at PRIO, Nils Petter Gleditsch, wrote an article about him, which will be the final chapter in a book I'm editing about lives in peace research, where we have interviewed people at PRIO from over the years. But I think that the academic quality that we hold at PRIO at the moment is not a weakness but a strength, and it does not preclude our normative approach to peace, where we try to come up also with policy proposals. What I would like to do now in the remaining 2 minutes is to propose some implications for peace research from the pandemic. Number one, we should take national leadership seriously. I'm not against bottom-up approaches, Kevin, but I think that we have seen in this pandemic an enormous difference in the quality of the top leaders in various countries. Some have simply not seen what's happening. Others have shown decisive leadership. We need to study leadership. And one example of this is a recent book about hotspots in internal conflict in Asia that takes leadership seriously. Number two, governance systems are affected by this. It seems that in the pandemic, well-institutionalized systems with strong states, be they authoritarian or democratic, have done well, and particularly in East Asia, while some governments that have populist elected leaders have done poorly. Third, there are now strong narrative battles between the two sides of the US-Chinese relationship about the guilt in the pandemic. These propaganda efforts from both sides are worth being studied by peace researchers themselves. Four, the fact that there are only about 30,000 deaths in all of East Asia, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia combined, but about 300,000 in Europe and soon 400,000 in North America. This accelerates the power shift from west to east. The reaction in East Asia to this transition, and also in the United States, are something we cannot leave to journalists and pure academic political scientists, but must be important topics in peace research. Then, number five, the common challenge to multilateral solutions and the crisis that we hope that the World Health Organization will get over. Multilateralism in a period with great difference between East and West must also be a topic. And then we have the boost to online communication in this period, which we as researchers experience when we have this kind of meetings. This is a momentous change in the world at the moment, where we must also look at the implications for peace. And number 8 is a question I ask, and that's particularly about China. Can China combine its protective firewall with global digital integration at the same time as it's trying? This, I think, that digital question is now also a key topic to take up in peace research. Sorry that I had to do this very short, but I'm also sure I exceeded the 3 minutes. Sorry.
Yes, you exceeded 3 minutes. But Jenny, how would you, compare your institute with the PRIO, and particularly in terms of normative orientation and theoretical orientation? What do you see the comparative advantage vis-a-vis PRIO?
Well, thank you so much, and I want to thank the organizers for setting up this extremely pertinent and timely discussion. I believe that PRIO and CIPRI are two sister institutions with a lot of exchange, and we are fully committed to the highest standards of research and remain firmly grounded in a normative basis. I would say that the field of peace research is maturing, it's growing, and it's becoming more professionalized. And what is particularly positive is that we see an increased policy demand for peace and conflict research as underpinning for policy action. But what I would say is that how we work or how we approach our job as peace researchers is perhaps one of the key points I would like to make. And this has been very much brought to the fore by the current pandemic. So we basically have to think about how we organize ourselves internally and how we can adapt to changing realities, and most importantly also to the salience of research partners that we need to collaborate with in order to get our job done. So it's about working through others and finding complementary ways of accessing respondents, or of being able to carry out surveys or questionnaires, including with populations who find themselves in the most vulnerable and conflict-exposed settings. So I would really like to flag the salience of partnerships and of strategic partnered approaches as an overall way to advance not only peace research, but also the practice of peace building. And I can give examples to that effect, but I am not sure whether I have reached my 3-minute time limit by now.
Can I add one little word to what Janne is saying? That your director, Dan Smith, he was my director at PRIO first, and then he took over after Kevin Clements as director of International Alert, and now he's director of CIPRI. I have made a long interview with him, which is published on the PRIO website, where he tells how well he liked to lead PRIO, how well he liked to lead International Alert, but how much more he likes to now be director of CIPRI. Right.
But you're not like China and the US, right? Jenny?
So now,
Between PRIO and CIPRI are not like between... The relationship between PRIO and CIPRI is not like the relationship between China and the US, right? Your corporate
no,
relation.
that's fine.
Right, that's fine. Okay. Anyhow,
We are organically integrated, as Stein succinctly put it.
anyhow, and I think they work very closely. Dan Smith used to be the head of PRIO, then moved to the SPRI. Therefore, they're personal exchanges and institutional cooperations too. But anyhow, Jenny, thank you very much for summing up to your point in less than 3 minutes. Now, Muthaya, can you give us your view of all this study, state of discipline on peace studies in Asia Pacific, since you have been dealing with that issue, not only peace but also security?
Thank you, Changin. I would say that I don't come to this from peace studies angle. I'm really a security person, and I look at peace in the context of security. And so, to me, I think the peace studies is kind of washed away now, and maybe not. But some people here, most people here are very focused on peace studies, but I myself am focused on security and peace. I think peace studies is becoming more part of IR now, rather than a separate. And so I think the institutes that are devoted to peace are no longer relevant, I think. This may be a controversial argument, but I think it is something that I feel very strongly about. And second is, I think we need to address, I didn't know this conference is going to be devoted to coronavirus and its impact alone. I think we can deal with corona, but my view is that the other conflicts will continue. And the traditional security, what we call traditional security conflicts, will continue even after corona, after the vaccine is administered. And I think it's important to focus on those. And I think the part of the problem is the vocabulary. And my paper, in fact, suggests changing discourse on vocabulary of peace research, I think. One is understanding the conflicts, internal and international. I think the combination between nation state and nation state is very important. And likewise, I think between negative peace and positive peace is also very important. And we need to move forward on both those ideas. And I think right now what I'm suggesting might seem very implausible, but then slavery and anti-slavery, the norms, international norms, how did they come about? That kind of research is necessary, and I think we've got to popularize new ideas about nation-state and nation-state, as well as negative peace and positive peace. And that's really, my take on this issue, I think. And nation-state, you can see that there are two ways to approach nation-state. And the nation is an ethnic nation or a civic nation, but prioritizing citizenship over ethnicity is very, very important.
But Kevin, do you agree with Muthaiya's argument? Because the study of peace.
Well, that's one of the big challenges, I think, that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that peace and conflict studies to some extent is suffering negative reactions because of its success. I mean, we got things like conflict prevention and confidence building and common security and cooperative security onto the international agenda, and now and as Matthias said, it's certainly gone into hard security studies and into international relations theory and critical theory. But the big challenge is whether or not there is still something very distinctive at the heart of peace and conflict studies, which is not captured by the others. And I think it has to do with things like building community, really kind of paying attention to the revival of multilateral and regional institutions, looking at processes as much as outcomes. There are a whole variety of things, I think, which we do, which are not done by other more hard-headed sorts of orientations to these issues.
Stein, what did you take between all this, Muthaiya, the realist, and Kevin Clement at the ideal or liberal? What is your stance on that one?
I've learned a lot from all, and very much from Muthaiya Alagapa's work in the security field. As a peace researcher, I have been struggling together with other peace researchers to make us worthy also of being taken seriously by security researchers, and I think we have succeeded pretty well with that, but not by giving up our peace research orientation. But for some strange reason, peace research strikes a chord in some countries. I think definitely in South Korea. South Korea is the country I think that I had most contact with outside Scandinavia when I was PRIO director. And my big hope now is that peace research will also be taken up by more university students and professors in China, because that's so important for the future. In Europe, it's strong. In Germany, Scandinavia, Britain, hardly taken up at all in France. And in India, it's pretty strong as well. But there are other countries in Asia, like I think Malaysia, where I have not met one single person defining him or herself as a peace researcher. I have one little thing to make where I disagree with Johan Galtung, and this is on the terminology positive, negative peace. In my view, what is called negative peace, which means absence of violence or absence of war, is already positive, because war and violence are negative. So if you take away the negative, you get two negatives, and that's positive. So positive peace is already absence of violence. So therefore, I like very much that Muthaiya Alagapa in his concept paper also talked about minimum peace and maximum peace or more peace. I talk often about fragile peace and viable peace as my two different qualities. I think Johan Galtung has had an unfortunate success with that dichotomy, negative, positive peace.
Jenny, what did you take?
That's also why. Sorry, can I just say this? That's also one reason why quality peace and inclusive peace is.
Jenny, what did you take on this debate? What did you take on this debate?
I think that it's very much a question of what empirical problems that we are trying to answer. So I don't fundamentally see a big distinction. There may be different causes of peace as compared to causes of violence. And in that sense, I do believe that we still have an underdeveloped understanding of what are the key actors, institutions, mechanisms of peace. But then I again would really like to highlight the sort of the practical aspect, and I think that's the advance, and that's the exciting part of the world that we live in today. And in that respect, I would like to go back and actually talk a little bit about the partnerships that CIPRI has, both with multilateral actors, such as the World Food Programme, now the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, where we are actually working together, trying to understand the impact that WFP has in contributing to peace within the context of its own operations. So we work together with the WFP. We are embedded in their teams. We do case studies in 13 countries where we systematically gather evidence with the ultimate aim of informing future WFP programming. So that's one exciting facet of our policy practice research. Another facet that I would like to highlight is the local partnerships that we are engaged in the Sahel, in West Africa, where we have, our team has essentially built up an infrastructure of local partner organizations and research institutes, where we have then direct collaboration and means to actually go out and do interviews, do focus group discussions and surveys in really hard to access areas. And those partnerships have allowed us to actually stay grounded and be able to continue our research on peace and resilience in these very remote conflict-affected communities in spite of the COVID pandemic.
Kevin, your last remarks.
I think yes, I just want to sort of underline that there's been a lot of research recently on trying to develop indicators that kind of give us a much better understanding of what peace really means, both negatively and positively, and that's why the quality peace work and so forth is really important. And I think that we need to kind of mainstream that a bit more in terms of security thinking, because I don't think that the security specialists have really got a good grasp of what peace is apart from an absence of violence and war.
Okay, thank you very much for participating in the first group. Now we should move to the second group. Okay, second group, we'll be talking about what are the implications of COVID-19 on peace and conflict in the Asia Pacific. We'll start with Charles Morrison. Same rule will apply. You will have a maximum 3 minutes, but so that we can come up with a second and third round. Charles, I was really shocked that you didn't use a Thucydides trap like Graham Allison, but you are paying attention to, Milo's speech, the strong prevails, the weak got to suffer. I was shocked to, see your concept paper. Please.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to the previous speakers for, I thought, very interesting comments. A lot of us wrote one way or another about COVID and about how it can impact peace. But my thinking basically is that the peace is not really a result of grand vision. It's not so much, it's more piece in parts. And it usually comes out of crises. And we have in COVID a crisis that is so worldwide and moved so quickly, 4 months from the first discovery in China until it was all over the world. It really is an opportunity that should not be lost to try to strengthen the architecture globally on health issues. I think we've understood that the World Health Organization is a significant body, but it is mainly one for the exchange of information and working on specific diseases as a result of voluntary contributions. And so we need some way, I think, to ensure that we can identify diseases, and that countries have obligations, much more strict obligations, to allow teams to come in and investigate. I think also there's clearly, as already has been mentioned, a problem on the vaccine side. If we have, and the news is encouraging, how is it going to be distributed and shared? And also we had a serious problem on medical equipment, on things like masks. Immediately, countries, for very understandable reasons, put export constraints. Other countries suffered from that. And then when those restraints went off, all of a sudden there were poor quality. So that's really a World Trade Organization problem. It's one of standards and of exchange of goods at a time of crisis. We put a lot of effort in the World Trade Organization on environmental goods and services. We haven't so much on health goods and services. So let me just start with that, Chung In, and we'll move on.
Okay, now, Richard, since you have been focusing on, really China, Japan, and the United States, and how do you see the situation? Do you think that the really new Cold War was triggered by the rise of the coronavirus? Oh, sorry, I'm confused. I'm doing multiple things.
I did hear you. I did hear the question. So that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I have been focusing on, as you talked about, these traditional security issues, but hearing this conversation, I'll switch slightly and then come back to that. I think we're, as we all know, in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, we're going through a fundamental turning point in the post-war era. The way that the region has been run since the 1950s is obviously over, or in the process of being over. I think COVID-19 has been particularly interesting because we've got non-traditional security issues accelerating traditional security problems. Let me first of all talk about some of the themes of non-traditional security issues. As Stein mentioned, state capacity. That's the core to Chinese strength, whereas state capacity in the US has been allowed to wither in many different ways in recent years. That doesn't mean there's a particular single East Asian model. Just look at Taiwan and China, which have handled it very differently in their own ways through very different political systems. State capacity feeds into other issues, vaccines, public health systems, which have been tested in many countries. It's accelerated also the big meta trend in economic growth. China, as coming out of COVID-19 quite quickly, will now probably overtake the US as the world's largest economy 1 or 2 or 3 years earlier than predicted. That has profound implications for traditional security issues. Protectionism, which has already been accentuated during Donald Trump's administration, I think as the trend towards protectionism has been strengthened, PPEs, pharmaceuticals and the like. And I think don't underestimate confidence. Chinese confidence in their own system, declining US confidence in the US system. So all of those issues, I think, have fed into the broader and accelerated the broader traditional security problems that we're having in Asia. And really there's nothing to sort of offset that. All the traditional, all the sort of talk shops, if you like, the Quad, BRI, East Asia Summit, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, APEC, and the like, none of them have singularly cooperative mindset which can bring the US and China together and thus help offset the more dangerous trends. Just briefly to finish, because I don't want to go over my 3 minutes. The main, I think we were asked to sort of make suggestions. Don't make every issue a binary decision about taking sides. That's inevitable in some cases. It doesn't have to be with everything. Grab chances for cooperation. Pandemic is a perfect opportunity for that, and obviously it hasn't been taken. And try to build genuine regional forums to offset what you talked about there, about the sort of us, to quote Henry Kissinger, being in the foothills of a new Cold War. I'll finish on that point, and I can come back to other points about the Cold War issues and the like traditional security issues, if you like.
Thank you. Melly, now that's your topic, non-traditional security. Melly, can you hear me? Melly, can you hear me?
Thanks. Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to sort of link my intervention within the context of this peace, security, non-traditional security, and COVID. I think what has happened, I'm speaking particularly from the context of Southeast Asia, is that what has happened with COVID is underscoring of what security is to many countries in the region. And in this case, I would like to go back to Mataya Alagapa's very important concept of comprehensive security, which we studied when I was in postgrad, and basically saying that security is not just about military security or tensions between states, but really provides all the other elements of security, political, economic, etc. But what has happened in light of a fast, interconnected global environment is that security is no longer just about state issues, but really about human security issues when, if it is not attended to, becomes a major security issue, in fact, can also aggravate interstate rivalry. So COVID is a very good example. In the context of East Asia, or South, the ASEAN +3, this is not the first time that we have experienced a pandemic. Right, we had SARS in 2003, H1N1, and of course the others, like Korea, MERS, and all that. But this is where a non-traditional security, like health security, which was a health issue, a public health issue, which in the security literature does not feature at all because it's a public health issue, has actually been, in the context of Southeast Asia, an important ingredient to peace and security. As a country is secure if it gets health insecurity in order. So as a result of what happened in SARS is that within Southeast Asia and the wider East Asia, they set up all these multilateral frameworks. So you had, a long listing of health mechanisms right within the ASEAN and the ASEAN +3, and this explains also largely the ability of countries in East Asia to actually be prepared when COVID-19 basically broke out. And this is where all the mechanisms of cooperative security, if you like, or multilateral security cooperation came in. Having said that, it led to various other forms of security cooperation, and it basically underscored the importance of multilateral security cooperation. So in light of that, now fast forward since February when COVID-19 hit the region, we are now talking about creating, for example, a regional centers of disease control, something that in Southeast Asia or East Asia was not thought about before. So many of this non-traditional way of thinking, of ensuring security has come to the forefront. But But to follow up to what Richard has said, in spite of all this multilateral cooperation, it does not mean that the tensions between states are in a way mitigated, and we see that now in the context of the wider Indo-Pacific, where you have lack of leadership from the U.S. and the suspicion about China and the origins of the pandemic. So all of these major tensions have come to the fore, and this is where again you ask yourself, can there ever be security or peace for as long as these tensions come about? But the long and short of my presentation is it is important, and going back to Kevin's point earlier, that many of these issues that have not featured in the literature, for example, public health emergencies as part, or health security as part of our thinking about what security is now coming to the fore, and not just public health issues, but also climate change. So security concept has expanded. Realist theories do not like it, but in the 21st century problems, we have to find a way to mainstream them in our scholarship and in our policy thinking. And this is where I think, as far as the field is concerned, the policy thinkers are more advanced as far as the scholars are concerned. Scholars are catching up with how security has evolved in this part of the world, and security thinking and the concept of security. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Okay.
Thank you. Obiel?
Well, it would be nice, wouldn't it, if the major impediment to peace was simply the COVID-19 epidemic. Indeed, one might have imagined that since that epidemic was a common interest and a global threat, it would have catalyzed a more peaceful, more concerted effort. But alas, it has not. And I think, of course, for those of us who are not in peace studies, but who simply worry about the state of the world and look around to see where the major tension points are, as Richard suggested, you cannot avoid the U.S. and China. And I think here, if we expect to have a peaceful world, we are going to have some sort of a resolution to that tension. But it isn't simply a tension now between the U.S. and China. It is really a tension between China and a whole host of other countries that have very different kinds of governments and value systems. And I think this really lies at the heart. This is the radioactive core of why we don't have a very tension-free and potentially very fraught world. Now, I think just to finish one thought up, I think that there's no prospect of resolving this issue or bringing about any sort of a peaceful resolution with China unless China can sort of step over its narrative of victimization and allow itself greater flexibility, greater diplomatic ability to give and take, because there is no way to resolve issues unless people compromise. And this is precisely what it has the most difficult problem doing right now, because it identifies any kind of compromise or yielding or concessions with weakness. So how do we snip through that sort of embattlement which prevents us from having any kind of a discussion where behind that Nixon and Kissinger had, let's say, in 72, where we could reset the terms of the game. I hear the United States hasn't done very well lately either. I'm not sure that Biden's going to have a much easier time because of the nature of the Xi Jinping government. So I think that if you are concerned about peace, you have to look at the two major sort of players on the stage who are preventing peace. And, of course, Russia's off on the side. But I think the real threat is China, because it's a country that actually works, and it's powerful, and it's rich. And so this, for me, is really where the question of any sort of a more peaceful and less fraught world devolves on the question of what are we going to do? How are we going to reconcile with the system in the People's Republic of China that is utterly and completely antithetical to liberal democratic forms of government, as clumsy, as chaotic, and as ineffective as they sometimes are.
Peter Hayes, do you agree with Orville's observation? Without handling China-U.S. problem, there might not be a peace in Asia-Pacific.
Yes, I think we are at a very dangerous moment in what I'll call the pandemic nuclear nexus, which entails a possible increased reliance on nuclear weapons, which are the most spatially distanced weapons in the world, for reliance on conventional force, which of course is vulnerable to the virus and the effects of which could invite some states to be more aggressive. It could destabilize militaries, could incapacitate their leaders. We've already seen that with 2 supreme nuclear commanders out of the 9 in this pandemic, and could lead to instability and an increased risk of nuclear war. Now, on the other hand, it may make states more cautious, lower tension, etc. But to me, this is a far too narrow appreciation of the security stakes in the pandemic. To me, the pandemic is driving a re-spatialization of the world on the scale that was imposed by European imperialism and how that remade the world spatially, and then by the post-World War II Cold War bifurcation of the world. And this is happening driven by the pandemic at all levels, from individual, household, community, cities, provinces, national borders, in production, in consumption. I just don't think we see how radical a change is that's underway, even as we're living in it. And what we can say is that war in pandemic conditions is going to be very difficult for everyone and will pose a severe credibility issue for those who threaten to go to war at the moment on a large scale. I'm talking about the great powers here. Now, if we flip it from how COVID creates insecurity to how COVID could drive a peacemaking and conflict resolution agenda, then I think we're obliged to admit at the outset that an enormous amount really rests on U.S. The Biden policy towards China and on what they mean by COVID multilateralism as the basis for a new U.S. post-Trump foreign policy. In that context, the vaccine moment is probably the most critical, because my reading is that only when you combine American logistics with the Chinese capacity to build infrastructure in public health, global public health, can you possibly hope to deliver the vaccine on a global basis and create the capacity at a global level for public health security. Otherwise, we'll remain subject to reservoirs of pathogens, whether it's this pandemic or the next one that will be coming up fast behind it. So that, to me, is the most critical moment, but that's quickly followed by what would be a regional economic recovery and post-COVID reconstruction framework for dealing with the impacts on the economy of the pandemic. And to me, it's not clear that RCEP is the framework, and if not, what? The only other comment I just want to make, listening to our peace researcher colleagues, is that I do worry how we're all relying on our existing social capital, the trust that we have in our existing social networks that has come from working shoulder to shoulder, face to face over so many years, especially when we're dealing across borders with enemy states where people have taken great risks to get to know each other in the past Korea and to some extent China. And I'm really not sure relying just on distanced contact and virtual interaction for many years. We can do it now because we're running down our social capital, but it's going to be tough to do that without meeting if the pandemics just keep on coming. I'll stop there.
Richard, do you agree with Obil that China should take more drastic measures to change itself in order to have a better relations with the United States? And also, is there any possibility the President-elect Joe Biden would come up with a much more selective engagement with China, particularly in the areas of pandemic, weapons of mass destruction, climate change, and etc.? And that kind of new relationship would help improving relationship between Beijing and Washington?
Well, there's certainly room for the Biden administration to have selective cooperation, but I would hope that selective cooperation then isn't conditioned on all manner of other issues as perhaps it was in the Obama administration. Climate change, I think, is a good example. China, as China has shown, has ample incentive itself to work on climate change with or without cooperation from the United States. Obviously, it's much better if the two do cooperate. On the general policy framework, there's been a spate of articles since the election of Mr. Biden about what he can do to reach out to China. We read almost nothing about what Xi Jinping could do to reach out or change policy to reach out to the United States. It won't matter what the Biden administration does unless there is also a change of policy in China. And I think that's quite difficult at the moment because I think Chinese foreign policy is essentially set by internal politics, by the China dream, the great rejuvenation of the nation. China is set on a course, as it may well decide to do, with ambitions in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, in the East China Sea. India is a little bit separate. And if China continues to roll in a singular way down that track, be it fast or slow, it's very difficult, number one, to see how we get there without conflict. The US is in relative decline, but I don't think it's going to sort of disappear across the Western Pacific in some sort of bourgeois decline. Or secondly, the region will be a very unhappy place with a single Chinese hegemon. So I think, we need to see changes in China under Xi Jinping at the moment. That's very difficult.
Obiel, do you agree with Richard? But if you listen to Henry Kissinger, and he said that the Cold War should be avoided and also can be avoided. Do you agree with Dr. Kissinger's observation?
Well, I think Dr. Kissinger is a bit excessively optimistic, having told us we are in the foothills of a Cold War, to suggest that it can be avoided. I'm not so sure. Of course, I'd love to see it avoided. But, I think that the real problem is that when you talk with Chinese counterparts, it's always, what can the United States do? What's the United States' fault? And the United States has fault, there's no doubt about it. You get utter silence when you ask, where has China been wrong? Where has China been excessive? Where might China make some amendments to its policy? So I think short of that, as Richard said, I don't see any sort of a resolution. And indeed, the pandemic, it's sort of like a cosmic confirmation of our decoupling, which isn't just in trade and investment. It's in every single aspect of our existence, from scholarly relations to media, to music, to art, to culture. And this is creating an incomparable loss, because this musculature is dwindling between China and countries like Australia, countries, all around the world. At the same time that it's very active, aggressive, and successful as a marketplace, and Belt and Road with the AIIB, things like that. So it's a tremendous paradox. And if China was simply Russia, a technocratic military state with with certain expansionist intentions, then you wouldn't worry so much. But it is an economic powerhouse. We've never experienced anything like this in the past. So how we deal with that challenge is at the center of any discussion of peace, in my view. And I don't have an answer for it because I don't, like Richard, I don't see Xi Jinping changing.
Charles, do you share Obil's pessimism?
Yeah, I pretty much do. I don't worry about a hot war. I do worry about a cold war. I do think the leadership in both China and the U.S. has been very problematic in recent years. One difference is that we got rid of our leader, or are in the process of doing so, and the Chinese have not. But I think there are some more fundamental things. One is how we look at power. And the American Revolution was based on fear of concentrated power at the center level. And so we have the federal system, we have the checks and balances, we have the two houses of Congress, and it makes our system difficult in dealing with anything except typically good leadership and emergency. In the Chinese historical experience, I think it's probably just the opposite. Many borders, periodic invasions. When China was divided, China was weak, and so it kind of tends to give a different orientation toward the Chinese. And then the other thing I think that we have to remember is that when we talk about international institutions, many of them were created in the transatlantic world shortly after the end of the World War II. And they're basically rooted in long traditions of Western philosophy and experience. And a lot of non-Western nations have embraced some of the concepts, but they don't have that same experience behind them. And so they don't embed them in the same way. And that is frequently, I think, a tension in relationships of Western and non-Western countries, and particularly China and the U.S. What I see is a period ahead of hard bargaining, kind of practical steps. But I think it's in the interest of both countries to work with each other, and I'm hopeful that that something like that can happen. Maybe not in the next 2 or 3 years, but over time. We obviously have to work with each other in order for each of us to have security and peace.
Melly, what is the ASEAN position? Which side are you taking? Are you trying to balance between the two, or? But I heard the rumor that ASEAN is taking side with the United States, turning against China. Is it true?
Well, the official answer that you would get from diplomats is that we never choose between the U.S. and China. And choosing one is dangerous because as far as the region is concerned, it's always been very careful about playing this, a game between choosing the liberal or the illiberal world. Now, in the experience of Southeast Asia, as you know, they have the ASEAN, and ASEAN has been, since the 1990s, especially at the end of the Cold War, one of the first builders of multilateral institutions. That's why it decided to establish what they call ASEAN-led institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN +3, and in 2005, the East Asia Summit, which basically brought together all these major powers in a framework where you're supposed to encourage habits of cooperation and confidence building, etc. So the position of ASEAN has been that you should as much as possible not divide the world, make it a more inclusive form of cooperation between which brings together like-minded and non-like-minded states. Now, at the practical level, there are of course a lot of concern about the aggressiveness of China. You can see, for example, that under the shadow of COVID, there was China's aggression in the South China Sea was most visible in April of this year. And in that respect, ASEAN, to some observers, has really not been strong enough to call out China. And at the same time, it also does not want to be seen as antagonizing China. So it's really caught in this difficult position. And what it tries to do, to the extent possible, is to sort of strike what they call some kind of strategic autonomy, if you like, by being drawn to neither powers, but instead focusing on in the context of a highly charged security and political environment, bring down the temperature and focus on functional cooperation. And this is where, when you look at a COVID-19 world, it's not that bad, actually. When you think about COVID as transforming our way of life, well, there will be some who will say that, pandemic is something that has happened, that will happen, but for as long as you have the right mechanisms and the right practices, for example, pandemic preparedness, at the same time, being mindful of observing the new norms in international health and international health regulations, like mandatory reporting of infectious diseases. And this is where I think regional forums can weigh on China, and ASEAN has done that, to be more transparent when it comes to outbreaks of pandemics, because this then, if failing that, then you really have the world basically closing down as a result of this. So ASEAN has been very careful in in maintaining dialogues, the JoJo versus war kind of thing, but at the same time, really coming up with more, more visible areas of cooperation. This has been the ASEAN position all this while.
Thank you. Now we finished the Group 2 discussion. Now we are getting to Group 3 discussion. Thank you very much for waiting so long time. Jonathan, and we have discovered that Asia Pacific is full of conflict. And we need your remedial solutions. We need your magic touch so that we can resolve all those conflicts. Please, what is your take on that?
I'm afraid I don't think I have a magic answer, but let me talk about some of the changes that might have an impact in the region. But firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I'm a mere practitioner, not a scholar like all of those who've spoken before. The things I've observed are, firstly, there's much less inclination to have mediators in peace processes now. If you look at Ethiopia at the moment, Prime Minister Abiy has rejected the idea of a mediator. North Korea was very unkeen on anyone mediating between them and the United States. In Colombia, there was no mediator. In Afghanistan, there's no mediator. So to work on peace, we need to find out more imaginative ways of doing it. And increasingly, that's a matter for individuals, for NGOs, and particularly for the establishment of back channels, building channels secretly between sides that can make advances. And I think that's the thing we need to try and concentrate on. How do you have virtual mediation? Can you have advisors from both sides, as we had in Colombia, working on transitional justice, working together to get to peace? The second change I've seen is prevention, the focus on prevention rather than ending armed conflicts after they've begun. But I'm afraid to say it is not enormously successful. Again, if we look at Ethiopia, many people have called for progress on talks, but instead we're plunged into a hot war. In Venezuela, people have been trying to work to prevent an armed conflict, and so far there hasn't been an armed conflict, but there is a real conflict in which people are suffering, and prevention, which the EU in particular is focusing on, has not necessarily succeeded. The third thing I observed is the withdrawal of the United States, pulling back under President Trump. So in Syria or in Libya, there is no US role. And without that US role, other players come in, like Turkey and Russia, to try and solve them. Of course, that may change with President Biden coming in. Fourthly, the role of China. You've been talking about the tension, obviously, between China and the United States. But one unremarked on thing is the way that China itself has tried to play a role as mediator in Afghanistan and in Burma and elsewhere. It has generally done so in a rather cack-handed and unfortunate way. It is interesting at trying to move into this field of mediation itself. And I think all of this applies to your own conflict, and I'm glad we're doing this in Seoul virtually, because it seems to me that is a real focus of peace. And I think in terms of North Korea, the things that I've talked about will have an impact. A new President Biden will have a different approach from President Trump. He may well not be so committed to all in one go as President Trump was for solving North Korea, but more willing to look at doing it step by step. We need to look at back channels because of the North Korean reluctance to engage. How do we actually get engagement between the United States and North Korea? And I think we have to look at China too, because if a Biden administration is trying a slightly new approach to China, they can't avoid talking about North Korea. That will not solve North Korea, but it will give us a new way of trying to deal with it. And lastly, in my 3 minutes, I just want to say one thing I've learned from 20 odd years now of working on conflicts is that just because you don't succeed the first time does not mean you won't succeed if you keep trying. In Northern Ireland, we had 4 attempts at peace, and it was only the last one that succeeded. Likewise in Colombia, likewise in Mozambique. And I strongly believe that in North Korea, if President Moon keeps applying himself, if the new US administration applies itself, there is the possibility of getting to a peaceful solution, however depressed we may be about progress so far. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some, people here who have done the endless effort toward North Korea. Here is Ki Park. Okay, Ki, would you tell us your experience, and would you tell us what should be done in dealing with North Korea, particularly with regard to the pandemic, since you're a medical doctor?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Moon. I want to make just a brief comment about this overall health, peace, the discussion. One is this positive and negative definition of peace. And we have the same challenge within the definition of health. So we say, and at least WHO's definition of health is it's a complete state of well-being in 3 dimensions: physical, mental, and social, and not just the lack of illness. And so in some ways, there's this sort of a similarity in peace. I do think that it's a continuum, and lack of conflict doesn't mean there's peace. And then, I'm a surgeon, as you know, I'm a neurosurgeon. And in health, we're like the ones that are on the battlegrounds. We're the soldiers. We're the ones that are sort of the grunts. And we're actually, and then I left, I'm still a neurosurgeon, but I went back to school and became a public health practitioner. And if you talk to surgeons, at least a couple of decades back, they say if you want to go into public health, they thought you were kind of not serious about surgery. And I suspect, and that's changed a lot, because now we have a huge numbers of surgeons who actually are now practicing public health. I suspect that something similar, that the relationship between sort of the hardcore international relations people and then peace researchers. And I think there needs to be a connection between those 2 communities. And then in the context of this current pandemic, I think it has completely upended the traditional thinking. It really has made people, at least governments, self-reflect on what should be their priorities, because as people have mentioned, military spending has been going up. I tell you, not a bullet or even a nuclear missile cannot stop a single virus. It is completely defenseless against that. And then it has to be a reset, a great reset regarding how governments prioritize human security and where they allocate their money. I hope in the future that the budgets for public health spending and human security are at least as in par with military spending. I know I'm being very optimistic. And let's talk about North Korea in specific context. We already have seen how the leaders of these U.S., North Korea, and South Korea have already been communicating because within the pandemic, because within global health security, the security is as good as the weakest link. No one is safe until we are all safe. So we saw letters going back and forth between U.S. to North Korea to South Korea. So there's this willingness to cooperate and put down some of the animosities and have adversaries work together. So I do have some specific recommendations on what could happen. I think there needs to be a large reset in how we approach human security and the Korean Peninsula, specifically North Korea. I think it needs to be comprehensive. As you know, right now, there's lots of banking channel, customs issues, logistical issues, and it has to be completely overhauled. Sanctions has to be rolled back at some level, at least to allow large-scale humanitarian activities to continue. And there has to be a multi-stakeholder approach for multiple reasons. One for political continuity. And the package, whatever the package we have offering North Korea, and I agree with Peter Hayes on this thing. It needs to be a large enough package. It has to be unprecedented to get their attention. And from a tactical standpoint, we should operationalize this by focusing on pandemic preparedness, provision of massive testing, large amounts of medical countermeasures. And here's the key. The discussion has to be about COVID vaccine. Without providing North Koreans an assurance that they will have full access to the COVID vaccine, this is where they need assurance. They're afraid. This has to be a key component of whatever re-engagement we have with North Korea.
Thank you, Key. Jean, what did you take? You have been doing a lot of works on North Korea too, but is it not easy for you to do work with North Korea, particularly in Washington, because all kinds of sanctions and restrictions? Jean, would you tell us, your experience and what to be done? Jean, we cannot hear you. Would you check whether you have a mute or not? Very strange. Okay, so Jean, we'll come back later. Okay, why don't you fix your problem? Okay, 이은정 교수님께서는 우리 한국말로 하시는 게 더 편하시니까 독일어가 아니기 때문에 이은정 교수님이 사실상 베를린 대학교 교수하시면서 큰 역할을 하신 게 김일성 종합대학 학생들 12명을 초청을 해서 한국 학생들 한 25명하고 같이 해서 작년 12월에 상당히 중요한 경험을 했어요. 같이 지내다 보니까 남과 북의 차이가 별로 없다라고 하는 걸 느끼셨다고 얘기를 하시는데 그거 포함해서 전반적인 지금 유럽 상황이 어떻게 되는지 그리고 유럽에서 지금 북한 문제 다루는 것들은 어떻게 진행되고 있는지 이런 것들 좀 얘기해 주시면서 우리가 지금 어떤 행동을 해야 될지 이걸 좀 말씀해 주시면 고맙겠네요.
제가 지금 두 가지 질문을 선생님이 하셨는데요. 그러니까 북한 김일성 대학 학생들을 베를린에 초대한 것과 유럽에서의 대북 정책에 대해서 우리 그러니까 자유대학교 한국학 연구소를 중심으로 베를린에서 어떤 입장을 취하는가를 질문을 하셨는데요. 첫 번째 질문하신 건 그러니까 김일성 대학 학생들을 베를린으로 초청해서 독일 문화와 독일 언어를 연수할 수 있게 했던 작업은 김일성 대학하고 저희 자유대학 학교 간의 교류 협력 관계를 통해서 이루어진 것이었거든요. 그러니까 굉장히 형식적으로 이미 파트너십이 만들어졌고 그 파트너십이 체결되는 과정은 어떻게 보면은 2011년서부터 2019년까지 올해 준비 기간을 거쳐서 그 양쪽이 서로 방문을 하면서 그 10년 동안의 기간을부터 그 연수 프로그램이 실현된 것이었습니다. 연수 프로그램이 까지 학교 간의 노력도 있었고, 그다음 양쪽 독일 외무부의 노력도 있었고, 독일의 많은 기관들이 도움을 받을 수가 있었습니다. 그러는 과정에서 저희가 많이 놀랐던 사실은 한편으로는 문화 교류, 독일 문화 교류를 위해서 이렇게 학교 간의 교류를 지원을 하지만 독일 문화, 유럽 외교 정책에서는 모든 것들이 북한 문제가 나온다면, 한반도 문제가 나온다면 모든 것이 비핵화 문제로 포커스가 맞춰졌다는 것에 대해서 저희가 굉장히 놀랐었습니다. 어떻게 보면 되게 모순적인 것. 한편으로는 문화 교류를 진행을 하면서 한편으로는 비핵화에 포커스를 맞춰서 센터 외에는 마치 한반도 약간 대북 정책에 대해서 전략이 없는 것처럼 하는 부분에 대해서 저희가 굉장히 의아하게 생각을 했었고, 그 부분에 대해서 독일 내에, 그리고 유럽사회 내에 있는 시민사회 여러 단체들하고 같이 독일 연방 정부에 대해서 문제를 제기하는 것을 계속 해왔습니다. 일단은 그 이유는 독일과 유럽의 역사를 볼 때 시민사회의 다양한 행위자들이 평화 정착에 적극적으로 참여한 경험들이 있기 때문에 일단은 냉전 주로 핵문제로 인한 긴장이 있었지만 그 핵문제로 인한 긴장에도 불구하고 다양한 시민사회 단체들이 다양한 행위자들이 이러한 각자 역할을 하면서 어떻게 보면 대화의 모멘텀을 찾아갔는데, 지금 현재에서는 우리가 그런 역할을 허용하지 않는 것이 아니라 연방정부가 그런 역할을 허용해주지 않는 것이 아니냐라는 생각을 저희가 하고 있었습니다. 그래서 지금까지의 유럽의 역사적 경험을 바탕으로 우리가 이런 유럽의 경험을 한반도에 시사해주는 유럽의 경험이 한반도에 무엇을 시사해주는가 하는 것을 찾는다는 의미에서 그런 의미에서 우리가 지금 다양한 시민단체들하고 그리고 think-tank들하고 협력해서 과연 독일의 대한반도 정책이 어떤 식으로 변화하는 것이 더 좋을까 하는 것에서 제안을 해왔고, 그 포커스는 다양한 행위자들이 참여할 수 있는 공간을 더 확대해줘야 된다 하는 것과, 그것과 마찬가지 동시에 다양한 주제, 그러니까 비핵화, 그러니까 핵 문제로만 모든 것이 포커스가 맞춰지지 않고, 북한 문제나 한반도 문제 이야기할 때는 오히려 더 사회 문제도 있고, 교육 문제도 있고, 환경 문제까지 포함이 되겠죠. 그러니까 다양한 주제들이 논의 선상에 도래함으로써 비핵화 문제에 모든 것이 포커스가 맞춰진 현재의 긴장 상태를 극복할 수 않을까라는 것을 알리는 작업을 저희들이 하기 위해서 베를린에서 노력을 하고 있습니다. 그런 의미에서 그것이 일종의 학습을 수행한 것도 하나의 그 노력이 있습니다.
Yeah. So, Jean, can you use your audio? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, excellent. Please go ahead.
So what I was going to say that as a journalist covering Korea, both North Korea and South Korea, North Korea is of course the biggest challenge. It is the biggest challenge for any foreign correspondent. I, in my 20-year career, covered many challenging assignments, but North Korea was the most challenging. And part of it is that we know so little about them. It's difficult to get access to them. It's difficult to wade through the propaganda, understand what is significant, what is real. And so it takes many years for any journalist to truly understand what this country is about. And of course, if you don't have access on the ground, it's even more complicated. So my mission was to find a way, as an American journalist, as a Korean American journalist, so there are many layers, as a woman, and many layers of challenges to try to do something that no other journalists had done, no other American journalists had done, and that was to get to North Korea. But one thing that was very interesting when I started this journey and started these negotiations was, you have to use every tool that you have. What I find so fascinating about this forum is that you're bringing together all these brilliant minds. I am learning so much from what I've heard today. And that with a Seoul Peace Forum, you would be able to bring all of that to bear on the Korean Peninsula, where these issues of peace and security are really, truly pressing. But for us to also find ways to apply that to North Korea, because what I found was that as a journalist seeking to get on the ground and to connect with the North Koreans, to understand that story, I had to use every tool that I had as a woman, as an ethnic Korean, as an American, even though those were challenges. And I would say that in some ways, even the terms that we're discussing, peace and security, in some ways those are defined differently inside North Korea. And that's important to understand that they have a different value system. They have a different political system. They have a different way of engaging with the world. And it's up to us to try to understand how to speak to them, how to reach them, how to get to them. One of the things that I noticed as bureau chief for the AP, I ran both the Seoul bureaus, and of course I negotiated the opening of the Pyongyang bureau. You have different vocabularies in South Korea and North Korea. One of the words we hear so often, which I love about South Korea, is 희망, hope. You hear that so often in vocabulary, in titles, in conference names. There's such a sense of optimism, which I think has really, truly driven South Korea's success. It's a word that we hear very rarely in North Korea, and I found that so demoralizing in some ways, because it made me wonder what it is about their view of the future that they don't use the word hope. 희망 is a word I did not hear very often in North Korea. How do we reach them and instill that sense of hope and optimism in the future? One of the major concerns I have right now, the nuclear threat with North Korea certainly has not subsided. I would argue that it has become exponentially worse over the past 4 years. But even the added layer and the complication that COVID presents, it brings another layer of complication, because how North Korea has responded to COVID is to retreat into a self-imposed isolation. That means that we have less access to them and they have less access to us. I think that there are some very promising things happening right now. The fact that we will have a new president in the White House, a president who has prioritized repairing relationships, repairing alliances in the region is very, very important, because when it comes to North Korea, I think having somewhat of a united stance, coordinating, consulting, acting in concert is extremely important. Not giving them the chance to play a game of divide and conquer, which is what they prefer, because they prefer to be able to control those relationships. So perhaps, as Jonathan Powell mentioned, it might be the use of mediators, but I would say that it's making sure that all the stakeholders in the region have a chance to express both their needs and their wants. But as well, I think in President-elect Biden's commitment to principled diplomacy, I talk a lot about how when I worked with the North Koreans, I'm not sure that we have a phrase of principled journalism, but it was principled engagement, making sure that we're constantly reaching out, serving as a bridge, making myself available to serve as a bridge to the outside world, but being tough at every step, making sure that I didn't sacrifice my own principles or the news industry's principles in reaching out to them. And so I think that that's very important, and that's very good for long-term engagement. So these are things that I see as being very promising, even though it looks so bleak. And even though I think we'll have to wait to see what Kim Jong-un himself decides after assessing the situation, both with this new presidency in the White House and with COVID. And we should get some sense after or at the Party Congress in North Korea in 2021 what direction that will take. But I think there's promise. I'm not sure. I know, Professor Moon, you might want to get to what can we do, and I hope we'll get to that discussion as well, because I think there are many people who will have some ideas on how to be proactive and prepared for that time when North Korea does choose to come out of its isolation.
Thank you, Jane. Last but not the least, let me invite Dr. So Hwang-jin. We're speaking in Korean. 그러니까 지금 우선 서울시에서 그동안 했던 거 간단히 이 주제와 관련해서 간단히 설명을 좀 해주시고요. 앞으로 어떤 행동을 할 것인가, 어떤 계획을 있는가 좀 말씀해 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
앞에서 많은 분들이 말씀을 하셨지만 이 코로나19는 한 개인이 또는 도시가 또 한 국가가 아무리 철저하게 노력을 하더라도 그 문제를 제대로 해결하기는 어렵다는, 세계가 아주 연결돼 있고 또 다자간 협력과 연대라는 것이 필수적이라는 것, 이런 것들을 새롭게 다시 한번 확인해 준 것 같습니다. 서울시의 경우에는 사실은 이 코로나19 문제가 한국에서 가장 인구가 집중되어 있는 대도시이기 때문에 가장 위협적이고 심각한 양상으로 발생할 그런 가능성이 있었는데, 대한민국 정부와 서울시가 조기에 아주 선제적인 대응, 아주 적극적인 대응들을 펼치면서 비교적 아주 잘 대응했다라는 평가를 받고 있습니다. 그래서 서울시는 올해 6월 1일부터 5일까지 세계 주요 도시의 메이어들을 온라인으로 초청을 해서 CAC, Cities Against COVID-19 글로벌 서밋을 아주 빠른 시간에 개최를 했고, 그 과정에서 서울시의 경험, 또 다른 도시의 경험들을 서로 나누고 또 공유하는 그런 시간을 만들었었습니다. 그 회의를 통해서 고 박원순 시장은 Cities Alliance Against Pandemic이라고 하는 이름의 도시간 감염병 대응을 할 수 있는 국제기구를 제안하기도 했고, 또 여기에 참여한 42개 도시의 메이어들이 여러 가지 정보 공유와 함께 서울 선언문이라는 것을 채택했습니다. 이 서울 선언문의 내용에는 도시 차원에서 어떻게 다자간 협력을 효과적으로 이루어낼 것인가, 기본적인 감염병에 대한 정보 교류에서부터 구체적으로 감염병이 발생했을 때 인적, 물적으로 도시 간에 서로 간에 어떻게 신속하게 지원할 수 있을지, 또 전문 인력이 굉장히 중요할 텐데 이 전문 인력을 양성하기 위해서 도시 간의 인적 교류는 또 어떻게 할 것인지, 더 나아가서 여러 가지 사회 경제적인 어려움을 겪게 되는데 가급적이면 도시 간에 개방하고 서로 교류를 활성화함으로써 이런 사회 경제적 어려움을 사전에 예방하는 방안, 이런 것들을 담은 서울 선언문을 만들기도 했습니다. 이런 것들은 도시 차원에서 다자간 협력과 연대라는 것이 굉장히 기묘하고 또 가능할 수 있다라고 하는 것을 보여주기도 했는데요. 한 달 뒤에 그 웹사이트를 보니까 전 세계에 있는 보건정책 담당자들이나 또 전문가들이 이 다양한 경험들을 보기 위해서 2,500만 뷰를 한 달 만에 달성할 정도로 이런 어렵고 까다로운 전문적인 주제로서는 굉장히 많은 관심과 참여가 있었다라고 볼 수 있습니다. 박원순 시장이 한 달 뒤에 사망함으로써 사실은 조금 어려움을 겪고 있습니다만은 서울시가 그것을 계속 이어서 또 서울시의 경험, 또 다른 도시의 경험들을 서로 배우고 나누는 노력들을 계속할 생각이고, 한 가지만 더 말씀을 드린다면은 이 서울시가 국제적인 다른 도시들과의 교류뿐만 아니라 사실은 한반도 내에서 당장 또 어려움을 겪고 있는 북한과의 교류 협력이라는 것들이 또한 측면에서 굉장히 중요한 문제이기 때문에 그 부분에 대한 또 시도도 했습니다. 다들 예상하고 있겠습니다만은 북한은 이 경제 제재 또 대북 제재와 관련해서, 그리고 거기에 더해서 코로나19로 인한 철저한 어떤 봉쇄, 이런 것들이 스스로 이렇게 진행이 되면서 노인이나 어린이들 또 굉장히 주민들이 어려움을 겪고 있는 것은 분명한 사실입니다. 그래서 이런 상황을 극복하는 데 있어서 뭐 세계 다른 도시나 다른 기관들뿐만 아니라 대한민국도 서울시가 간과할 수 없는 문제이기 때문에 여기에 도움을 주기 위한 인도적 지원 정책을 적극적으로 서울시가 결정을 했는데, 다 알다시피 유엔이 강력한 대북 제재를 하고 있는 상황이지만 이 인도적 지원은 대북 제재 대상이 아니라는 점들을 우리가 인식하고, 서울시가 지자체 처음으로, 지방정부 처음으로 코로나19 진단 장비나 방역 물품 지원을 위해서 대북 제재 면제를 승인을 받아서 그 작업을 진행했습니다. 그걸 구체적으로 실행할 수 있는 방안으로는 국제기구인 유니세프를 활용을 해서 유니세프의 도움을 받았는데, 유니세프와 MOU를 체결하고 올해 2월에 유니세프에 30만 불을 공여금을 지원함으로써 유니세프가 이 돈을 활용해서 북한의 방호복, 또 방호물자, 세정제 이런 것들을 지원하는 실질적인 실행을 할 수 있었습니다. 이런 경험들을 보면은 코로나19를 대응하는 과정에서 남북의 협력, 또 남북 지방정부나 민간단체의 어떤 참여 이런 것들이 남북 간의 어떤 신뢰, 또 교류 이런 것들을 새롭게 만들어 나갈 수 있는 그런 가능성을 보여주었다 이렇게 생각을 하고 있습니다.
감사합니다. Now let us have a final, general discussion. You can raise whatever questions, but we would be very much interested in the agenda for action in the future. As you know, this Seoul Peace Dialogue is kind of prelude to next year's Seoul Peace Forum. And I understand that the Woodrow Wilson Center, University of Berlin, Harvard Medical School, and Intermediate, and then Melis Institute and East-West Center, Asia Society, Lowy Institute, Nautilus Institute, Toda Peace Institute, CIPRI, PRIO, and Muthaya. What is your affiliation?
University of Malaya, but I'm here in Washington, D.C.
Okay, and your University of Malaya, the ASEAN representative, and therefore you will all be stakeholders for the next year's Seoul Peace Forum. With this assumption, let us talk about an agenda for action and some major themes for the next year. Now, for example, Jonathan, you proposed the idea of setting up the Regional Center for Conflict Resolution, but you haven't really addressed while you're giving a talk. Can you elaborate on that idea?
I can hear you.
Go ahead, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Many years ago, many decades ago, I worked on the CSE negotiations in Europe that brought together all the nations of the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and actually played an important role in bringing down the Berlin Wall and the changes in Europe that brought unity to Europe. And I think there's a case for your part of the world too, having something like a CSE structure, and by having something told that could generate the ideas for that, it might be possible to plant the germ of such a regional security dialogue, starting from something with NGOs and academics in Seoul that could grow into a bigger forum between governments.
I think that, but that is one of the intentions of, Seoul City to organize this Seoul Peace Forum, But I think that would be a wonderful idea, and we can institutionalize that kind of dialogue every year in Seoul. Peter, you talked about the nuclear pandemic nexus, and also you have been proposing this, Northeast Asian Public Health Initiative. Can you elaborate on that a little bit so that there can be kind of an agenda for next year's, Seoul Peace Forum?
Sure. Well, at the moment, W, of course, is working in the West Pacific and East Asia region, but it's a relatively weak structure, and it needs tremendous infusion of funding and expertise. And I don't think that it's really capable of responding to the needs driven by the pandemic, which really doesn't pay much attention to what we care about. What it cares about is infecting humans. So the imperative for cooperation in the region in terms of sharing best practice, sharing material, sharing vaccine, sharing training, increased access and transparency so that you know what's coming down the pipeline. There's just an enormous agenda for cooperation in Northeast Asia to increase public health security. Now, that is something that should be done irrespective of North Korea. But if we think about North Korea as a black hole and as a potential reservoir of various public health risks, not just this pandemic, but there are quite a few actual diseases in North Korea. But we also look at North Korea as a potential contributor to the public good, then engaging North Korea is, as one of the previous speakers said, absolutely necessary for the global good, because you can't have a black hole where the virus is free to come and go at will. You've got to integrate North Korea into that public health network, that public health infrastructure. Very simple things could be done. For example, the Tuman wetlands is one of the world's great transmission belts for the avian viruses. All the different birds in the East Asian Beltway that fly from down here in Australia all the way to Korea, then on into into Siberia. Some of them fly all the way from East Asia to the United States and back. That goes right through North Korea. Now, other countries in the region, Indonesia, Vietnam, China, Russia and the Far East, all have laboratories where they collect samples from these birds to monitor the transmission over these migratory routes. North Korea does not. That's the kind of scientific project where they can become contributors to the global public good, and we gain some access and we start to engage them on these kinds of issues.
No, Peter,
so it really, I think...
We are not excluding North Korea. President Moon Jae-in proposed Northeast Asian Public Health Initiative. We extend the invitation to Pyongyang, but no response. Key Park, you have been dealing with North Korea for a long time. Would North Korea respond positively to President Moon Jae-in's Northeast Asian Public Health Initiative?
In the short answer, no. And let me elaborate. It would be a terrible mistake at this point for us to decide on doing a project or two in North Korea regarding COVID. We have an amazing opportunity to set up something that starts with health, but it has to be multilateral. So the question is, what is required for North Koreans to come to the table, right? And not just a health representative. It starts with health. Whatever the mechanism is, Koreans to a dialogue, it has to have sufficient oomph, right? Sufficient backbone to be able to go beyond health and be able to liaise with South Korea, U.S., Japan, China, Russia. So the key here is going to be, how do we set that up? But it has to be I think the COVID-19 and pandemic preparedness and the vaccine is a good place to start this dialogue. But it has to have those tentacles that allow eventual, the progression into diplomatic discussions.
Now, Obi, let me turn to the China-U.S. relations. Obi, don't you see any role to be played by Japan, South Korea, Australia, ASEAN countries to bring China and the U.S. together? We hate the revival of old Cold War, because if we have a new Cold War, we cannot go to North Korea, we cannot go to China, we cannot go to Russia. We become the crippled peninsula state. Therefore, we Koreans hate Korean division, Korean War, protracted military conflict are all the product of Cold War. How can we avoid Cold War? What role can we play?
Well, actually, I think that's a very good question. I think countries like Korea find themselves caught in the middle, just as the ASEAN countries also find themselves caught in the middle. They don't want to have to decide for one side or the other. You're trapped in between two grinding tectonic plates. So I think that could stress upon you a role that you could play as you are right now, but you try to both bring the major players, in this case it would be China and the United States, but increasingly it's China and India, China and Australia, China and Canada, China and Sweden. China has alienated all of these countries in ways that I think do beg some sort of counseling. So Korea could play that role, as could Singapore, as could other countries who find themselves literally stuck in the middle. Because I think it is probably an inescapable trend that the middle is going to disappear and Korea is going to be trapped. So you might as well try to make the best arrangement you can to try to keep that contradiction conforming in every way you possibly can, or you will be forced, I think, to decide, at least if present trends continue. Think of what would happen if there was even a very modest clash in the South China Sea. Some move on Taiwan, or the Senkaku Islands, Jiaoyuda, where suddenly China made a move. I mean, it would then create oil and water sort of situation separating, and Korea then, I think, would really be pushed in ways that it doesn't want to be pushed and has avoided for the present. So I think that role is one that you could play much more actively, much more aggressively, just almost a neutral power.
Richard, again, I'm being saddened by, obvious, very pessimistic projection of a power trend in this part of the world. Richard, do you agree with, okay, let me ask Richard first, and then Kevin and Melly, okay? And then Stein.
Okay, I'll be quick. I think you can look at it in the opposite way in some respects from Orwell. It's either the end of middle powers or it should be a golden age of agency for middle powers, because particularly allies with the United States, because if the US is doing less, other countries have to do more. At another forum, at another time, I would like to hear South Koreans talk a little bit more about South Korea's relationship with China. This is your neighbor. This is a neighbor who has imposed sanctions on you over THAAD. You had a negotiated settlement of that. I think the South Korean-China relationship is very interesting, and I think one that many other countries are watching to see how South Korea holds its own in that relationship.
Okay, Kevin?
2 points. One is that in total, one of the things that the board has just agreed to do is to begin developing a new study group on building trust, confidence building, regional security mechanisms in Northeast Asia. And so we'd be very open to kind of collaborating with any other of the groups and organizations that are represented here on that venture, so that we can begin thinking very systematically about what's needed right now in this particular context. But an issue which I think we've been skirting and needs to be put very firmly on the table has to do with the divided West itself. One of the sobering, and I think that until we, in a sense, come to terms with the divisions that exist within the West and the whole Western project, it's going to be very challenging for us to kind of think about alternative relationships with China or with other parts of Southeast Asia, for that matter. One of the alarming things about the last election was that 71 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, even though he's arguably the most corrupt, least democratic, most autocratic, and most ineffective president of recent time. Now, what does that say about the kind of Western project and Western democracy? So I think there's a whole issue here around the nature of the democratic project itself and what that means in terms of these sorting out other relationships with countries that have no pretension of being democratic. And I think this is one of the biggest issues that we really have to face, which has to do with the whole question of dialogue within the West, really, within and between different Western countries about the nature of the relationships we wish to have with rising Asia.
Okay. I will give 2 minutes to Melly, okay, and then Stein, and then Musaya, and Charles. and Jen, okay?
Thank you. Before we could get sort of too pessimistic about the future of the world in light of this kind of 21st century challenges that we're facing, I think we should not also overlook the fact that in the midst of all this major power rivalry, there is actually some kind of cooperation on a technical basis. And in this particular instance, I'm talking about health cooperation. Within the ASEAN plus 3 framework, there's been a long history of health cooperation in highly pathogenic diseases. And Korea was a major player in that, and so is Japan and China. And when it comes to, encouraging transparency in disease reporting, etc., there has been a history of China after SARS, right, coming and engaging with its +2 Northeast Asian neighbors and 10 ASEAN countries in actually disease reporting. And that is why, as a matter of record, some ASEAN countries, ASEAN officials have said that as early as January, there was a lot of communication. And that, in a way, helped them in pandemic preparedness and response. So the long and short of what I'm saying is there is something that you can build on multilateral institutions in the region that in hopefully, with China can also bring in some way or other in North Korea. And when you look at some of the areas that they're cooperating now, for example, vaccine production and distribution, this is now the kind of discussion that's taking place concretely in the region. So, you already have this low-hanging fruit, so to speak, areas in functional cooperation that will mitigate existing major power cooperation. So I don't think we should overlook that. And my plea is to pay attention to these areas, because these are the incremental steps that you can take to help promote health security and the wider security in the region, and in the process of doing so, actually contribute to peace.
Thank you. Stein, Charles, and Jenny.
I think it's essential for us to keep channels open into China with our friends and colleagues in China, and I think this is threatened. I understand it's threatened, and I think it's extremely sad what has happened under Xi Jinping. One name that comes up to me all the time is Michael Kovrig, whom I met at conferences in China and in Vietnam, and who then was arrested and has now been in prison for 2 years as a Canadian citizen formerly working for the International Crisis Group. But in spite of that, I still must up that contact. Also, I think that Orville, I don't think the middle will disappear. I think there are so many countries that are deeply integrated with China economically and through technology transfer, so a kind of traditional Cold War would not work. I have attended in the last week, first one conference on the South China Sea in Hainan and then one in Hanoi. And at both these conferences, there are still Vietnamese and Chinese and Filipinos talking with each other. At the conference in China, there was a proposal to set up something on the model of the Arctic Council, and this came from a Chinese professor. At the meeting in Vietnam, there was much constructive talk about possible fishery cooperation as a way of developing cooperation in a very difficult situation in the South China Sea. All these positive kinds of proposals are also deeply held by people in China. We cannot criticize Xi Jinping because that's impossible. But think differently, and I'm absolutely sure at the back of my mind they are happy with Xi Jinping's leadership. Thank you.
Charles?
Did you call on me? I had 3 quick points. First is, how do small powers and middle-sized powers affect large power relationships? And the main way is through your systemic positioning. So if one large power is misbehaving, you shift this way. If another large power is misbehaving, you shift the other way. And normally, large powers pay attention to that. But what we don't know is whether either China or the United States would pay attention to it. But that's the normal way. Secondly, I think this municipal avenue is a very important one to work on. I noticed that Seoul has one of the widest networks of sister city relations in the world. And those sister city relationships include Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Tokyo, and many other national capitals, of course. And so this is a kind of network that potentially could be leveraged in something. Unfortunately, there's no relationship with Pyongyang, but Pyongyang and Seoul overlap in three relationships. Then I think another thing is to look at the North Pacific, not as a regional organization, but as an analytical framework for looking at some of these problems. I'm sorry for Southeast Asians, but for the moment, I think you need a smaller multilateral group that includes three largest economies in the world, most of the nuclear powers in the world, but only 7 countries. And so you can have rather rich discussions within that kind of a framework. And finally, I would say, I think that South Korea is disadvantaged vis-a-vis many opportunities toward the North, because the U.S. is no threat to the North. China is no threat to the North. But South Korea, in a sense, is a much more fundamental threat to the North Korean system, is because you're Koreans.
Jenny?
Well, I just want to generally reflect on the impact that COVID has had on a lot of peace processes around the world, and the mobility restrictions that prevent physical meetings. And I don't think it's possible to underestimate that component because some person-to-person conversations cannot be replaced over Zoom, for instance. So if this is a problem, then I very much agree with other speakers that perhaps it's an opportune avenue to explore public health as a vehicle and to use the work and collaboration around the pandemic as an entry point, while still having a longer transition and being quite persistent, as other speakers have highlighted. Oftentimes there are ups and downs in peace processes, and it may take many attempts over numerous decades to get to a favorable outcome. So these would just be my general reflections, and I thank you so much for this fruitful exchange.
Thank you very much. Now, time is up. Therefore, Musaya, okay, Musaya, your last comment. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. My comment is basically that North and South Korea. Is South Korea willing to give up unification or not? Will there be a Ministry of Unification in South Korea? Because if you can accept North Korea as a separate state, then you don't have a problem. But if you want to unify, and then the nature of a unified Korea becomes in question. So all these small projects about doing minor things are not going to help very much, I think, if you don't address the fundamental issue in the North-South divide. You have to address the fundamental issue, it seems to me.
하여간 대단히 감사합니다. 이제 시간이 이제 지나서 최종적으로 이제 랩업을 해야 될 시간인 것 같습니다. 오늘 토론 중에서 왜냐하면 제가 한국 시청자들을 위해서 제가 한국말로 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 우선 첫째는 개념적인 논쟁들이 많았습니다. 평화의 연구냐, 안보의 연구냐. 우리 무사야 교수님께서는 안보 연구가 더 옳은 길이다. 상당히 현실주의적 접근이고, 우리 케빈 교수님 포함해서 다른 분들은 평화 연구라고 하는 게 아직도 의미가 있다. 특히 오슬로와 스톡홀름에서는 그런 시각이 상당히 강한 것 같습니다. 그래서 또 그러면 평화도 적극적 평화냐, 소극적 평화냐, 안보도 적극적 평화냐, 적극적 안보냐, 소극적 안보냐, 이런 개념적 논의들이 있는데 이거에 대한 논쟁은 계속돼야 될 것 같고요. 그래서 내년 10월에 지금 예정돼 있는 서울 평화 포럼에서는 이런 이론적이고 개념적 논의들을 좀 해야 될 필요가 있다고 보고요. 두 번째, 이번 팬데믹 사태가 일어났고 보니까 마치 우리 아시아 태평양 지역은 판도라의 상자를 여는 것과 마찬가지입니다. 우선 제일 큰 문제는 오빌쉘 교수님하고 리차드 맥그레거 선생께서도 얘기하셨지만은 미중 대결이 지속되는 한은 소위 환구적인 평화를 보기는 상당히 힘들다. 그래서 미중 간의 강대국 정치라고 하는 것이 아시아 태평양의 질서를 흔들 수 있다라고 하는데 이 문제를 어떻게 다룰 것이냐. 그다음 자연히 우리 팬데믹 이슈 다뤄야 될 것이고 대량 살상 무기 그 피터 헤이즈 박사 교수께서도 얘기했지만 대량 살상 무기도 있죠. 기후 변화 문제도 있죠. 그다음에 아시아 국가들은 아까 무사야 알라가파 교수님께서도 얘기했지만은 민족 국가 웨스팔리안 소베런티, 웨스팔리아적인 주권 개념이 강하기 때문에 국가 간의 갈등도 상당히 많고 그다음 북한 핵 문제도 있고 이 다양한 문제들이 있는데 이런 현안 문제들을 어떻게 다루느냐라고 하는 것도 이제 중요한 그 논의상이었던 것 같습니다. 그래서 중요한 거는 내년에 서울 평화 포럼을 하게 되면 이런 그 커런 이슈들, 그 커런 현재 소위 분쟁적 이슈가 되는 것도 다룰 필요가 있다고 보고요. 세 번째 어느 방향으로 나가야 된다라고 하는 거에서 보면은 우리 그 조나산 파월 교수님께서도 이 말씀을 하셨습니다마는 지금 샹그릴라 안보대화 같은 데는 현역 장관들이 국방장관들이 가서 하는 대화거든요. 근데 이 아시아 태평양 지역의 평화와 안보를 연구하는 학자들이 하나의 올림픽을 하듯이 모이는 사례는 거의 없거든요. 그러니까 서울시가 중심이 돼서 그런 대화의 장, 포럼 포 다이얼로그를 만든다라고 하면 상당히 의미가 있지 않느냐. 그러면 그 안에서 결국에 공동의 내력을 통해서 지방자치단체들, 뭐 동경시, 북경시, 서울시 이런 데들이 소위 십시일반을 해갖고 결국에 가령 이 지역에 대한 뭐 Center for Conflict Resolution, 분쟁 해소 연구소 같은 것들 만든다면 상당히 의미가 있는 것 아니냐고 보고요. 그다음 여러분들이 아까 제안이도 그 얘기를 했지만은 지금 팬데믹이 우리에겐 소위 챌린지고 커스, 도전이고 저주이기도 하지만 그게 기회의 장을 제공할 수 있는 것 아니냐. 그래서 가령 북한을 지금 밖으로 나오고 우리하고 협력하게 하려고 하면은 결국 소위 코로나 문제에 우리가 도움을 주고 우리하고 같이 참여를 하고 그리고 키파기 얘기한 대로 거기에 많은 도움을 준다라고 하면은 아마 북한도 참여를 할 것이고 그러면 팬데믹을 통해서 긴장을 완화하고 신뢰를 구축을 하고 평화를 만들 수 있는 것 아니냐 하는 이런 얘기도 나왔던 것 같습니다. 그래서 뭐 여러 것들이 많고요. 또 다른 하나는 뭐 오늘 얘기는 안 했지만 내년에 이제 서울 평화 포럼을 하게 되면은 올림픽 문제가 나올 겁니다. 그러니까 우리 2018년에 평창 윈터 올림픽을 통해서 남북한 간의 새로운 평화의 가능성을 모색을 했지 않았습니까? 그렇기 때문에 내년 8월에 동경 올림픽이 있죠. 그것이 끝나고 나면은 또 북경 윈터 올림픽이 있습니다. 그리고 지금 서울시에서 노력하는 게 2032년 서머 올림픽을 평양과 공동 주최하는 노력을 지금 하는 중에 있습니다. 평양 측에서 지금 이 코로나 사태 때문에 밖으로 나오지 못해서 그러는데 지금 서울시에서는 평양하고 같이 해서 2032년 서머 올림픽을 서울과 평양이 공동 개최하는 것을 모색하고 있습니다. 국제올림픽위원회도 상당히 이런 아이디어에 대해서 우호적인데 그런 것들이 새로운 어떤 신뢰 구축의 돌파구를 마련할 수 있지 않을까 생각이 됩니다. 아무튼 여러분 대단히 감사합니다. 그리고 여러분 전부 다 내년 10월에 서울에서 직접 볼 수 있기를 바라겠습니다. 제안이도 지적을 했지만은 이게 소위 페이스 투 페이스 인터랙션하고 이 버추얼 인터랙션은 상당히 차이가 있는 것 같아요. 이 인간들은 피지컬 타치를 통해서 같이 밥도 먹고 술도 마시고 이렇게 그리고 히티드된 디베이트도 해야 더 본드가 강해지는 것 같습니다. 하여간 앞으로 우리 서울연구원을 중심으로 해서 13개의 연구기관들이 협업을 해서 하나의 새로운 평화를 위한 또는 안보를 위한 신화 창출의 계기가 되기를 간절히 바랍니다. 여러분 오늘 대단히 감사합니다. Good night, good morning, good afternoon. Bye bye.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. 마지막에 확실한 또 정리까지 잘 들어봤습니다. Thanks to all the presenters and the moderator Moon for being with us today. Through the 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue, we determined changing risk factors and discussed many ways of securing individuals safe and peaceful lives. Next year, we will host the first Seoul Peace Forum, where peace researchers, governments, and civil society practitioners will gather together to overcome war, build peace, and discuss the future altogether. Again, let me express my gratitude to all the concerned and presenters in the studio for being with us today. Thank you very much for watching 2020 Seoul Peace Dialogue. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much. Thank you.